Yeah, thank you, Josh, and others who listen in. Great to be able to share a little bit of my journey and the story of less parish collective and more what's kind of emerging as we imagine what church could look like in the neighborhoods that we're in. Uh, Traditionally been in traditional ministry for over 20 years, and that has been primarily in church planting roles. And recently, within the last number of years, as I have kind of connected within my neighborhood in increasing ways, realized the disconnection between church liturgy, spiritual practices, and the ways in which my neighbors were living in the day-to-day. So there was this imagination that they were looking for in terms of spirituality that the church wasn't providing. So when we gather around ideologies or tradition, it is just was becoming increasingly difficult for neighbors to connect in and feel that they actually belonged. So the church constructs created more of an us versus them than this collective welcome of my neighbors. So began to think about what church could look like if neighborhood became the organizing principle, where it really was an inclusive, diverse expression as my neighborhood is. So what would it look like if our gathering became about the neighborhood, not just about church or ideology? So that kind of put me on this path of discovery. What would it look like? And we started this event called Story Nights. And Story Nights really originated with just coming together with our neighbors and hearing the stories of good that each of them are doing in their communities. We were connecting also with local artists who are writing from a place-based narrative, whether that be musical artists, singer-songwriters, spoken word poets. So really it was a gathering together to hear music and poetry around issues that were being named within my neighborhood that many people may not have seen. So there are cracks and crevices in our neighborhoods that go unnoticed. And sometimes it takes a story to reveal what's broken. And there were also stories of hope, stories of resilience, stories of imagination where organizations, community organizations, nonprofits, social enterprise, business were actually beginning to see beginning to see the needs and do things that were weaving a span of love and care in the neighborhood. So we wanted those stories to be elevated because so many of us go about our day, but we don't actually know what's happening in our communities. So where do we go to hear the stories, to connect with those stories? And realized as we did this a few times that it was a faith community, that when you have music and poetry, art, you have stories about people and place. It became clear that there was this faith community that was starting to emerge. And it wasn't around the spiritual practices and traditions of the liturgy that I was familiar with. So we began to ask ourselves, what would liturgy look like, again, if it was in the neighborhood? Things like hospitality and organizing as a spiritual practice, prayer, music. So how do we engage our neighbors with a liturgy of spiritual practice? It isn't just for an hour and a bit on a Sunday, but actually is a way in which we live in our community. So we are experimenting, trying new things, and on that front, started last year a conversation that we call Reimagine, which is a conference that Parish Collective hosts in Hamilton to really link with others who are seeing the need to imagine and reimagine what church could look like in the cultural moment that we're in. But also hear stories of those that are reimagining and linking with them, linking together, sharing that story across boundaries and distance, and hearing what others are doing. So we last year was the first one. Tremendous movement, success in all the metrics, and just really neat seeing people come together, wanting to see church done a different way, where inclusion and belonging and connection and curiosity are the things that draw us together not are you Christian? So it's it's coming up again. I'm busy kind of crafting year two. And I would say if there's a challenge that we've been facing within Story Nights, but also in Reimagine, is how do we truly break up with the current dominant cultural narrative that so many of us live into? And that's hard as a white male who's privileged in many ways, most all the ways. I tick all the boxes, I think. What does it look like to actually break up with the dominant cultural narrative and actually reimagine something which I think Jesus did, which was subversive and on the edges? So I want to see a movement on the edges that is radical in its welcome, radical in its hospitality, radical in its compassion and generosity. And it's sad that we need to use the word radical, but we're not living out, I don't think, the Jesus story. And we get caught up in power dynamics that I think hinder this radical movement of love. So I want to see us get back to that, but it's breaking up with comfort and security and convenience and power are difficult. And I think we need to have voices from people of color, from queer, from those who are struggle with disability, and those who would be considered out of many of our neighborhoods. How do we see them come not just in, but also have their voice heard? And so we're trying to create a conversation where that can happen, and us to reimagine from that place, not from a dominant cultural narrative place.